Welcome to today's Australian British Chamber of Commerce and KPMG Federal Budget Breakfast. My name's David McCready, I'm the CEO of the Australian British Chamber of Commerce. We're delighted to partner with KPMG for the 12th year to bring you the insights from the federal budget the morning after the event. We've assembled a wonderful panel of experts who will unpick last night's federal budget and give you the insights that you need to take your business forward for the year ahead. For now, I'd like to pass to Doug Ferguson, the New South Wales Chairman of KPMG, to start the breakfast.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Could I just ask you please to be quiet as we start the event? Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Doug Ferguson, New South Wales Chairman for KPMG. And on behalf of KPMG and all of our partners present, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for being here so early in the morning to the 2021 KPMG Australia British Chamber of Commerce Budget Breakfast. Let us also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our joint respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And can we extend those respects to anyone of Aboriginal or Torres Strait background who might be in the audience or who might be joining us online. As David mentioned, this is our 12th straight event in partnership with BritCham, and I'd like to thank the new, although absent, Chairman Andrew Lowe, the CEO David McCready, the amazing team at BritCham, and also to all of you members and sponsors for again partnering with KPMG. When we started 12 years ago, I think we had only about 200 people in the room, and that grew substantially. I think about 3 years ago, we were up to about 600. It was one of the main events in the day immediately after the budget. Last year, we trimmed it back somewhat to 6, but we did pivot and have an online delivery mechanism, which we have today as well, a hybrid event. Last year, we had about 1,000 guests join us online. Today, just over 2,000. I'd like to welcome back the Honourable Warwick Smith AO, Chairman and Non-Executive Director of many, many things. But Warwick, thank you for being here. You haven't missed too many of the budget breakfasts over the last decade, and it's wonderful to have you back. Also to Ming Long AM, who's joining us again. Ming, thank you. This is your 4th, and it's wonderful to have you back for your insightful and challenging remarks. We've also got Tikki Fullerton, who's the business editor at large. Many of you will recognise from The Australian. And we have a few new faces this year as well. Some of my colleagues, Dr. Rynne, who's our Chief Economist, and also Gayle Dickerson, who's a co-head nationally for KPMG's Restructuring Services business. It's truly wonderful to be able to resume an in-person breakfast event. There were a few nervous moments over the weekend, but here we are, COVID safe, protocols in place and being observed, and I thank you all for continuing to attend and support our event. Clearly last year was very odd. It was our first virtual event, but it was also odd in the sense that the budget was handed down in October, very late compared to the normal of early May. It was also odd because the previous commitments to returning the budget to surplus were completely abandoned as the government immediately implemented a response package to deal with the COVID-19 emergency to keep us safe and to keep people financially alive. So a very different set of circumstances that we face this year. For those that attended the 2019 breakfast, that was my first as New South Wales Chair, you might remember that I'm a bit of an Australian history buff. So indulge me for a second as I quickly compare and contrast this budget response to that our government had to deal with in 1919, which was the Spanish flu. Very, very different. Historical measures suggest that in 1919 and 1920, the budgets were largely contractionary, and as opposed to extremely expansionary as we've seen last night. Government support for individuals and households during the Spanish flu was really limited to providing blankets, food vouchers and in-kind support, rather than the cash outlay that we've been able to fund and deliver over the last 2 years. Support for businesses was really very limited. Partial compensation for proven sustained losses after the fact in 1919, whereas now the government's been in a strong position to be able to continue to keep companies going and people employed. So while we still have our challenges, we're still in COVID, as the Treasurer said last night. We're in a very strong position relative to many countries in the world, and we should count ourselves extremely fortunate to be in this country and to have the economic management that we have. So now let's get onto the detailed discussion, the analysis, and also some fun and games. May I please now introduce and welcome to the stage Tikki Fullerton, our moderator. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Doug, very much. And I'd love to bring up our panel as well. Do come and join me. I might just remind everybody who we have up here. I must say, very glad to be here in 2021 and not 1919. Very glad to be here physically in person, because normally I'm in the lockup in Canberra, but guess what? They have a lockup in Sydney these days. Anybody else in a lockup anywhere? 6.5 hours? You won't get back? Nope. It was very good. Not too many surprises, I don't think. Right. Well, let me just remind everybody of our very interesting panel we've got here. Now, to my immediate right, Dr. Brendan Rynne, who's the Chief Economist at KPMG, and then Ming, Non-Executive Director, welcome back.
On the average.
And then the Honourable Warwick Smith, who's, amongst other things, as Doug said, many other things, Chairman of the Global Leadership Committee from the BCA. And at the end there, we've got Gayle Dickerson, who's a partner in Restructuring Services, who perhaps wasn't as busy in the last year as you might have been, Gayle. I'd like to kick off first with a very open question. I'd really like marks out of 10 from all of you, and whether there was anything big, important, surprising in this budget. Brendan, perhaps kick off with you.
Look, I think it's probably about a 8 out of 10. I wasn't expecting the continuation of the instant asset write-off for businesses for the extra year, which just reinforces to me that the budget still recognises that we're in a crisis, period of crisis.
That wasn't cheap.
No, $20 billion. And that really what that's now done is added to the budget deficits and the forward estimates, which we had started to claw back. So I don't think that we can't ignore the fact that the budget's still couched in the context that we're in a global crisis. But what the government's also looking to do is start to fix some parts of the economy, particularly in the social areas, that have been problematic for some time.
And they had to do that, didn't they? They had to deliver on that social dividend, even though, I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars.
Absolutely. We know there's been problems in aged care through the, you didn't need a Royal Commission to tell you that, but, we've had that. Further support for childcare as well, and also starting to provide additional services in mental health services, plus also additional spending in terms of helping to roll out the vaccine faster than what we've been seeing at the moment.
Yeah. So Ming Long, I think when you think about that, I think the numbers are 1.9 billion for the vaccine, and then 1.7 is it in childcare, over 2 billion mental health, 17 for aged care, 13 for NDIS. Spend. What did you think of the budget?
Giving it 6 out of 10 because it's not so much the announcement yesterday, it's actually the execution and delivery, which is actually probably the most critical part of the budget. And I do have questions just because of what we've experienced around the vaccine rollouts and the quarantine or lack of. I do have a question about their ability to deliver some of that sort of stuff. So it's a good start, but I think the devil will be in the detail in terms of how they actually push this out in the next year.
Yeah. Gayle, hopping over to you. Again, I said that from a restructuring point of view, less to do. As Brendan says, this continues to be a recovery budget. Are things hidden? Have we got zombie companies? How did you see this budget?
Well, I think if I'd been able to be in person this time last year, I would have been thinking, it'd be very, very busy. The biggest kind of financial crisis since the Second World War. There's going to be a raft, a tidal wave of insolvency hitting. And sitting here today, it really couldn't be further from the truth. There's over the last year, it's probably about 4,000 companies that would normally collapse that haven't on a normal year. The market's very buoyant. I really probably should be an M&A partner sitting up here today because they're very, very busy. They're too busy. They're back in the office. But, it is, but we still are in recovery, and that stimulus is starting to come off. And, I've heard this budget referred to as a caring but responsible budget. And, I look forward to exploring that with the panel today. Is it caring? Is it responsible enough? And has it given enough in terms of driving productivity?
Yeah, well, Warwick, perfect entree for you. Caring and responsible. Paul Bloxham, back down there, hello, Paul, who's sitting out this year. Normally he's up here, but I'm sure you're going to throw some grenades. But you were saying that actually next week is the New Zealand budget. Now they're into, ironically, a Labour budget, but into budget repair. There ain't much budget repair going on with this one, is there?
I didn't see much, really. I think, Tiki, my view about the budget is I'm blowing whistles because I think it's an appropriate budget for the very difficult circumstances that as a country we find ourselves in, and we're not out of it yet. So been some remarkable turnaround in budget estimates that we would all welcome. But then for 25 years now, I've been a banker, and I always worry about capacity to pay it back when you make a loan. So therein lies some future challenges in the out years. And one issue that I keep coming back to is Australia is fundamentally and always has been a trading nation. Success in our trade underpins our growth. When you look at the budget numbers, there's one product, largely sold to one country, and that underpins the capacity for us to deal with the things we should deal with: aged care, childcare, suicide, a greater focus on women, a lot of the things that we talked about at this panel last year. So we have to be principled about how we deal with all of those issues, but we also have to be realistic.
Warwick, can I interrupt
principled
you
realism
there?
I see from the Treasurer,
Yes.
but will it continue?
Now, you mentioned iron ore.
I didn't.
Well, one of the surprises, I guess, the few surprises that came out of the budget, was that the government has continued its assumption that the iron ore price will head to $55 a tonne in 2023, I think. Now, at the moment, this week, iron ore prices are 230. I mean, it's incredible, 230 a tonne. Do you think the Treasurer has done that because he's got an election next year and it's going to bring him a whole lot more lolly?
Prior to becoming a banker, I did spend a lot of time in Canberra. I know that there's a habit from both sides of politics to always be thinking about an election. So you can't say that hasn't been a consideration, but it is responsible what they've done in this budget. There's a standing invitation to our purchasers to buy at that rate of iron ore, and we hope that can keep doing it. But that's all about their demand and their alternative sources of supply. So you have to be realistic about that. Unlikely to see an immediate change back to $55. But the fastest return to growth of any nation is our principal customer of iron ore, which underpins their own growth. So we got through the global financial crisis for exactly the same reason.
Yes.
Exactly the same reason. So let's wait and see, but let's be realistic about the prospects of alternative situations that might emerge. So a prudent Treasury, and Kennedy, I have to say, is a standout Secretary of Treasury of our time, and he's prudent, he's careful, and has a capacity to think the big picture, and has capacity to give good advice about the social dividend that has been addressed and successfully in this budget.
Brendan, when we think about the incredible improvement really in the bottom line since the October budget, and indeed even since MyEFO, thanks to company taxes, but also thanks to jobs being created, to what extent could you look at that in terms of paying for some of these big structural initiatives? Because the thing is, these big changes to things like aged care, that cost is going to continue out, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, in many ways, the interesting thing will be whether the government's drunk the Kool-Aid for these social reforms and continue to drink the Kool-Aid. Because once you start, it needs to keep going. Very much you could look at the budget not only in the context of it being a crisis budget, but also being the preparation for another election. And so many of the policies and social policies that have been adopted by the government tend to be what you would think would happen on the left side of politics. But whether the current government's seen the light, recognise that it needs to keep spending down this part, because it's not only what's needed in society, but it's also changed their way of thinking as well, will be really interesting going forward.
Ming, do you think, in say 8-9 years' time, we're going to be in a bit of a problem with...
Definitely.
Yeah.
Where was it? We were talking about reform. Where was the reform in there? It's just, I did stand back and think, okay, it's great that they're spending so much on our social infrastructure because that's been underinvested for such a long time and we're paying the price for it now. But even in the announcement of aged care, I thought, okay, look, there's a pot of money, and they seem to be listening to the to what's come out of the Aged Care Royal Commission. But realistically, at some point, people who can pay more for aged care need to pay more for aged care, and we haven't tackled that. We haven't had a discussion around the fact that people who are wealthier in this country need to pay more for some of these services.
And at some point, somebody's going to have to draw the line and say who's going to pay for what.
Absolutely.
The government is pitching mental health as a productivity measure.
Yeah, but even with that piece, right, when I was looking at it, and yes, they're going to set up all these new clinics and headspace, centres, all that sort of stuff. But the critical piece around that is I was talking to a psychologist, and who works predominantly in men's mental health. And doctors in this area, they're saying they need more psychologists and psychiatrists, but we're not training anymore. So you can go up and rent all these spaces, but if we don't have the people to be able to fill those spaces so we can actually serve the community, that's why I'm concerned about the delivery of some of these announcements. The detail is absolutely critical, or we are just really wasting all of this money and just leaving debt to the next generation. Now, that may not be a problem if you believe in modern monetary theory, but the traditional thinking is that you will eventually need to pay back that debt.
Yeah, well, I know my stepson was looking at it this last night and thinking, how are we going to pay all this back? And
That's
I wonder
right.
whether this is not a millennial...
It is, and then we load the millennials with this debt without having a discussion around tax reform, and it almost feels like a dirty word to say tax reform, but we need to have that discussion. But the other piece we're loading up the next generation that's even more severe is the climate liability, and that is growing.
I'm going to come to climate, but Warwick, just on this whole who pays for what and the reform agenda or lack thereof. Now, the BCA was lobbying for a 20% investment allowance. I think expectations were managed ahead of the budget. You knew you weren't going to get that. We've got this temporary tax relief for largely small businesses. You've also got the digital piece for, again, getting small businesses into the cloud. I suspect it's the main driver. So what are we going to do? Because we've got business confidence at record highs, big business investment not happening.
Well, overall, business is very happy with this budget because it's focused on trying to address continued growth and particularly training and employment, which is an objective that the government should be focused on and is focused on. Investment allowance, big business does always need to be considered in the context of Australia, where over 90% of employment is in business, large and small. And so particularly if you're a trading nation, you want those businesses to thrive and to grow. The lower end and mid-level tax cuts are locked into this budget. We think that's important. The further tax cuts won't come out until 24. We're assuming that they will still be delivered or will still have the capability to deliver.
But you support those lower and middle income tax cuts?
I support them going forward, and they are, and I think that's important. It's a promise that was given. It's a promise that should be delivered. But just on a big business, the drivers for big business is domestic growth and global growth. We have a couple of issues that are starting to bite into the community. It's skills. Remember, we've had zero migration, we've got zero students, and we've got zero tourism, international tourism. They are big impacts across the economy for large and for small. Now, the short-term investment allowance that's been extended, it's probably quite good, but a larger investment allowance is going to be important. If you want to come back to looking at key reforms about what will build productivity in the medium to long term, it's about tax. It's about infrastructure. There's good infrastructure spend in this budget. Good infrastructure spend, but we will need to do more heavy lifting on some of the key areas of reform, and the Business Council have long said that, and investment allowance would be part of that process.
Right. Gayle, now, obviously there are certain parts of the economy that have been totally hammered through COVID and through our relations with our biggest trading partner. I think wine, for example, has been absolutely smashed. What has the budget done towards those people? Because there is some money, very targeted money, and is that the right thing to do?
Yeah, I think, the October budget kind of addressed everyone. This budget is much more targeted to particularly tourism. It's about 1.2 billion going to certain areas. I mean, it is very targeted to certain regional areas. I think certain CBD locations, and particularly hospitality, are still being impacted with the borders being shut. You mentioned wine. There's nothing really in here for wine. There's something small for brewers in terms of some tax incentives. So there are industries that fall outside of the budget. Wine's an example. I think higher education, really quite surprised not to see more to support those businesses as we kind of, waiting for the borders to open. And yes, we will start to get some students coming back, but, we still don't know exactly when that's going to be. So.
Well, this is the other really big concern, isn't it? That this assumption in the budget that international borders will be opened in mid-2022, and really not much detail around what happens once they do open. Would you say, Gayle?
I think that's right. Business wants some certainty. I understand. I think we all understand why we can't necessarily give that. We need to focus on the health of Australia first. But we do need to target support to those sectors most impacted by international borders being closed. And I'm supportive of that. I think there's some in the budget. There's probably some other sectors that are feeling today that they've been perhaps missed from that support. So, we will see some more insolvency creep back, but there's not going to be a huge wave. That's not our expectation. And I think, quite frankly, that probably won't come back to kind of some normal levels until 2023, 2024. And, we shouldn't forget this, that rejuvenation is actually part of our economy. So, yes, we've avoided a lot of insolvency, but it's good to reallocate capital to more productive assets. And some element of that is actually good.
Right. Look, there's so much to go through, and I will be throwing to the floor, so please get all questions ready for anyone you like. Brendan, let me pull this back to the macro and the assumption around unemployment, but also in the context of immigration and how that now, I think we've got, 4.75 forecast unemployment by the government out at 2023. That's slightly more conservative than the Reserve Bank.
Yes.
How do you think that is is going to hang, and how important is inflation? Because I noted my colleague Bob Gottliebson ran a piece yesterday saying, well, actually, we're going to get wage increases because simply we can't get anybody to come in. Do you see wage increases suddenly happening, or is it going to be a two-tiered economy in pockets?
Well, I think the thing to also recognise, and we all know this, is that the labour market in Australia is just a whole series of smaller individual markets by sector and by geography. So you actually do need to have a look at what's actually happening on an industry basis and then on a regional basis as well. So you can see that unemployment rate in Western Australia is below 5% at the moment already. New South Wales is slightly above 5%, and yet South Australia is above 6%. So I think it does depend on what industry sectors are growing the fastest. And while employment is about 100,000 higher in total than what it was going into the pandemic, we're now at about 3.1 million people employed. Most of the sectors, I think about 15 of the 19 industry sectors, have still got total jobs less than what it was at the start of the pandemic. In fact, most of the employment growth's been in public services, it's been in the financial sector, it's been in healthcare, and so it does depend on what sectors you're looking at. But ultimately what the government's trying to do is drive up wages and drive up inflation. They've been talking about trying to get inflation back within the RBA target band, and that they're also increasing wages as well. So if they do both of those things at once, it actually does nothing to living standards. So what we're actually wanting to do is to drive real wages growing higher. And we know that real wages, what drives real wages is productivity. It's the investment in high tech.
Is this a productivity-light budget?
No, not at all. There's very limited productivity. Very limited productivity. It's investment in high-tech capital in particular, and it's also strengthening the capital labour ratio in each of the different industries. And so we're not seeing any of that. So while we might lift the number of people employed, we're not really going to have an increase in our living standards to go with that.
So, Warwick, how do you see this soup then? Because the government's announced various things. Obviously, a big skills package. We've got this new talent thing that Peter Verber was looking at, attracting talent and businesses. But we've still got these closed borders. So how is this going to work?
Well, the closed borders is a reality of the global situation. I think they're being very cautious. There's a couple of segments that are really still continuing to hurt under this closed border. And we're not talking about global borders, we're talking between states as well, which was a new phenomenon that most of us even...
Well, look at Melbourne yesterday. I mean, what's...
So, but look, there's tourism, there's student housing, which sits outside of universities, is a first-class asset base, which has not even been used for quarantine. So there's accelerated ways in which some of this can be done, which I think they need to embrace, because bringing forward some variation to global border closure is becoming particularly important. But can I just pick up, Ticky, about productivity? I'm a lawyer. I got a red-socked, eminent economist down here. There's four elements of productivity. There's infrastructure. The four elements of productivity growth are infrastructure. We've got infrastructure spend in this budget. The other is education and training and skills acquisition. If you're working hard on those areas, we've got that as focused in this budget. We have, for the first time, a really coordinated approach to financial and digital activity and putting funds into that. In other words, lifting up information technology in the technology age in which we're in. That's a component of the delivery of infrastructure. And lastly, we have taxation and labour market. We don't have much labour market reform. That's a missing piece here.
Well, the EBA is dead, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a missing piece, but we do have a start on taxation reform. So it's not completely a short-term sugar hit budget. There is some long-term commitments. The forward spending on aged care is a 10-year issue. The forward spending on suicide, these are social dividends that should happen. But there is not an absence of consideration of the need to improve productivity. This was not the budget to do all of that. There are policy levers that they will need to pull in the near term if we want to be in a capacity to generate growth on a consistent basis to pay back the
But
debt.
if I push you there, what are the chances of another budget before the next election and of any of that happening as a result?
Oh, I thought that was the last question of the day. I predict an election in March, but there you go.
Brilliant. Ming,
Can I just pick up
Yes, you
something
can.
on that? Because if you have a look at what I saw in the budget papers anyway, it was very quick. There was a 9% cut to higher education, a cut to vocational. And that's the piece that really shocked me because businesses, there's been a dislocation of the employment relationships for a lot of people. So businesses are struggling to find, some businesses are struggling to find skilled workers for what they need. And we've got actually a lot of people looking for jobs as well. So that dislocation is not helping. To see that cut to training just astounded me when we're looking at trying to get more people into employment. We're spending more in aged care. We're spending more in infrastructure, social infrastructure. We need those people to work in those places. We have to be training them. And then we cut training. I don't understand that piece. And the second thing around the infrastructure, I know you want to spend a little bit more time on that, is where we are spending the infrastructure. And I was listening to the Treasurer. It was roads this, roads that. It's like, well, actually, where was climate in this?
So okay, let's look at what's missing in the budget. So environment, what would you have liked to have seen?
It was missing. It's just completely missing. There was no real new money in there except for, this is what drives me nuts, for carbon capture. So we are going to pay gas to dig up the gas, capture the carbon and put the carbon back in the ground. I just find that a complete waste of money.
Do you believe that gas is needed as a transition fuel?
I do not believe, because I think the economics will be such that renewable energy is moving so fast. Sorry?
How are you going to keep the grid stable?
The investment, where I would like to see the investment is actually in the grid and the connectedness and the ability for the grid to cope with more renewable energy.
So you think 3 hours different from west to east is enough to stabilise the grid?
We need to have that investment, right? So we can allow for more EVs. We can actually allow for more renewables to come into the grid. We have battery technology that can actually do all of that work, and we don't need gas to do that.
Right.
So there's just, where are we spending that money from an infrastructure perspective that's going to give us our productivity hit?
Yes.
It's not where they should be spending that money. You compare where they're spending the money to the Infrastructure Australia report,
yes,
and there are massive gaps there. So that's why I'm just not sure. There's money there for infrastructure, but is it going to the right place?
Right.
Well, it's going to the Midland Highway in Tasmania, and I'm pleased about that.
Ming, while I've got you there, how pink is this budget?
I think there are headlines that look very pink, but in underlying, I'm not sure if that's the case. So if you think about women's economic security, they tagged the childcare like it's just the women's thing. But last time I looked, men had kids too. So you sort of really need men in that equation. So, it is helpful to enable more parents to enter the workforce, which is exactly what we need right now when we have that skill shortage. That's helpful. They've got additional spending for domestic violence and, sort of shelters and that sort of stuff. I always look at that and I think that's good, but you're only funding the symptom. What you are not funding is the underlying cause, which is men's mental health issues, men's issues around how they're actually treating women. Where is the spending for that? Because that will actually deal with it on a permanent basis. If you have a look at the budget papers, you've got the increase in spending, a couple of $100 million over a number of years. And then it falls, I think, in 24, 25 back to like $2.5 million. So domestic violence will be sorted by then.
Right.
Is that what we really think? Yeah. When we haven't actually dealt with the underlying cause of why these things are happening.
Does it seem to be affecting the Prime Minister in the polls, Warwick, this women's issue?
It is very curious.
Very curious, isn't it? It's a bit like Donald Trump. When they actually go in and vote.
Yes, that's right.
Just saying, childcare, Brendan, what is to stop, given all the money that's been thrown into the system, just childcare prices going up and we've achieved nothing?
So again, a good question, but what I look to is the fact that there's still spare labour capacity. and that what you are looking to hope, well, what I'm anticipating to see is some movement from people in those sectors that still are struggling to find jobs into childcare areas to increase the supply of services. I recognise that there needs to be different ratios of skilled people within the whole labour pool within a childcare centre. So many have to be university qualified, so many have to be TAFE qualified, some can be general labour. But certainly I'm anticipating that there will be that incentive to drive up wages in that sector, which will cause more people to come in, stabilise wages and then increase supply overall.
That's good. Gayle, you mentioned this new frenzy of M&A around the place. I just wondered if you could colour that up for us, and what sort of sectors are looking exciting and with potential at the moment, and is this a good or a bad thing?
I think, I mean, if you put kind of the government stimulus to one side and that huge injection into the economy, I mean, there's about 7 trillion of household savings globally. There's about 2 trillion of dry powder out there. There is a lot of liquidity. There's a lot of capital out there looking for a home, looking for a higher rate of return, given where interest rates are at. So that is one, I think, pent-up demand, given that's come back, and March was a record quarter in terms of transactions, and maybe they're not necessarily at the same average deal value, but there's certainly in terms of volume there. There is also, I think in the economy, a lot of, the ATO has provided a lot of credit to business, about 70 billion, and is in no rush to collect that at the moment. And landlords have come to the table with about 2 billion in support. So, some of these are sitting outside of the budget, but are helping to drive some of this activity in the market. And we're seeing some pretty competitive valuations and multiples there, and that's very positive. And debt is cheap. But as long as those valuations stay there, and we're not in a situation where we're more highly leveraged and exposed, and I think we're going to come into quite a strong reporting season. But we need to just understand what is the sustainable level of growth, and putting aside what's here from the stimulus, what is from cost out, and what is the actual.
And we've seen cross-border, because, obviously our FIRB situation is very tight still from COVID and from the China tensions.
I think Australia is still seen as a safe haven. I expect when borders open, we're going to see a wave of people wanting to come and live here and holiday here. And I still think Australia is very attractive in terms of destination for capital, and I see that continuing. And anecdotally, on a lot of the transaction, it is coming from offshore in terms of that investment.
Warwick, do you want to add there? Just on trade, I suppose, generally, yeah.
Sorry.
Just on trade, generally.
Trade, as I said at the outset, trade is an essential element of the long-term growth for Australia. Yeah. Securing the trade, keeping the trade, diversifying the trade. Plenty of people have given lots of advice about that from Canberra, but I see nothing about it in the budget, by the way. There's some extra money for Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Largely that's going into, and rightly so, some support in the Pacific. But there's not a lot about trade. And yet it's an essential element of the long-term growth. I've done global reviews of Austrade recently. I think there is much more that can be done, and aggressively so. I use the word securing the trade as a subtle way of saying you really have to sort out the issues with your major customer colleagues. You really have to sort them out. You can phraseology any way you like, but those of you who interface with customers and look to get revenue from customers every day, put up your hand if you fight regularly with your major customer every day. How many people here think me as a banker are going to lend you money if you're fighting with your customers every day? You know the answer. So we have to think a little bit more rationally, realistically about these issues. Sure, there are global issues. Being focused on values and being focused on realism is not beyond the wit of sensible nations to manage.
Right.
That's all I say. That's what the Business Council says, and that's what needs to happen. If you want to pay back this debt, you're not going to tax the nation more to be able to do it if there is not growth in the economy. That's the message. That's the message. And people in Canberra need to get it.
Yep.
I hope someone heard down there.
Any other questions? We've got just a huge area to run across. So who'd like to start with the first question? Yep, Paul. Yes. There are 3 mics running around, so
Thanks.
it's Paul Bloxham.
Thanks. Yeah, Paul Bloxham, HSBC. My question is mostly for Warwick, but anyone can jump in. Will this budget, when we look back in 5 or 10 years' time, mark the point at which we decide that Australia is likely to be not a low-debt country, but a high-debt country? Because last year was understandable. We were in a shock. We delivered an enormous amount of stimulus. But now, who is the standard bearer for improving the budget, getting our debt under control? When we've shifted, obviously, we've got a Conservative government that's delivering an enormous amount of social support, understandably. It's not as though you can argue against those things. But there's no longer a discussion about we need to get the budget back to balance. There's no longer a discussion about how we're going to deal with the debt down the track. And, as has been apparent from this whole discussion, there's little discussion about how we're going to grow in the medium term our way out of this debt either, because there is no focus on reform, productivity enhancing reform. The border is currently closed and we have a major challenge with our major trading partner. So will we look back and say, hey, it was understandable in 2020, but by the time we got to 21, that was the turning point where there is no standard bearer now for trying to get the budget back under control, and we end up somewhere down the track, a high debt country?
Well, I think Brendan will have a good response from that, because I'd like to see economists have interchange. Look, you make a very, very good point. But my argument is that this budget is not absent in terms of thinking about the long term on productivity, but it's rightly focusing on the social dividend issues in this very extraordinary period that we're in. But I suppose that if I can go back to the banking analogy, debt's not bad. As a banker, I only made money because people take debt. It's their capacity to pay it back, and how can I help them be in a position where they can pay it back? And if we become a high debt nation, but we become a growth nation, we can manage the debt. And for us, our real growth curve is in trade. It always has been. It was wool. The wool of our time now is iron ore. Where are we going with LNG after yesterday's announcements of a review by China? It's our 4th largest revenue earner. Now, what's going to happen there? What's happening with students? So you've got to keep that in balance. So debt in itself is not bad by governments. That's the first part. The second part is more of a political question. Where are the advocates? We're on our way back is the slogan, I think, from the budget from last night by the government. My message to the Liberal Party is, and I'm still a Liberal, and I emphasise the word Liberal, there's no way back for the Liberal Party to go back to its heavy tendency towards conservative, reactionary approach to the community. If you're going to embrace the community with giving a social dividend, don't think politically you're going to be able to take it back overnight and get re-elected. You've changed the narrative. The era has changed. Politics has changed dramatically. The nutters that were in there that wanted to go back to, surplus budgets and we'll give it out at our leisure in some future time, that's not going to be able to be achieved in the medium to long term, in my view. So there's no way back for the Liberal Party.
But it's very interesting. If I bring Brendan in here, because actually the answer last night anyway was Jim Chalmers was the flag carrier of debt and deficit, wasn't it? He was talking about.
Jim's become immediately irrelevant after last night.
But it is interesting. This you make the point very well, Warwick. This shift in the narrative. We're not talking about absolute $980 billion of peak debt. We're talking about debt as a percentage of GDP. Right? This is the new thing, isn't it?
And Paul, I think it also depends on what you mean by a high debt country. So on a relative sense, when we look at Australia's net debt compared to overseas, we're still, even after all of this, at a relatively lower level of public sector debt or government debt compared to countries like even the US, Japan, the UK. But what we do have is higher levels of debt compared to what we're used to. And so I was just madly checking the budget, and I think at the end of the forward estimates will be something like net debt will be 40% of GDP. So, but the cost of that debt is about 0.7% of GDP. So it's the interest rates being so low. If we have a look at back to the mid-90s, our debt to GDP was half that, yet our interest repayments were double. So there is a understanding about how we can carry the debt and what's going to happen in this low interest rate environment, which I expect to see continue for quite some time. It does mean that we can carry the debt, but then we have to start focusing on how to pay it back. Now, there's only 4 ways to do that. You either increase taxation, decrease spending, inflate your way out of the problem, or you grow the economy. That's it. I mean, there's no other options. What we did learn from the GFC was that those first 2 measures, which are austerity measures, create more pain as a consequence if you do them badly, too hard, too fast. If we try to inflate our way out of the problem, we're going to lose Reserve Bank credibility. And so ultimately, we've only got one option, which is to grow the economy faster than otherwise would.
Let me bring in another question, maybe from that end of the room. Anyone over there? Or this end? Question? Not at the moment? All right, keep thinking.
Vicky?
Ming, can I ask you to... Oh, sorry, one there. Yes, sir.
Michael House from Plantagenet Wines. My question is around the vaccination rollout. Do you think Australia is complacent? Are we living in a bubble? And are we too slow?
Ming, do you want to take that one?
We are in a bubble. We are too slow. I also have a very unpopular opinion around vaccines because we have actually done well in terms of keeping COVID under control in this country. That if we actually do want borders open as soon as possible, we need to be making sure that overseas countries where it's running rampant get the vaccines before us. I know that is so unpopular because everyone says to me, well, you're on a plane, you're supposed to put a mask on first before you put a mask on somebody else. But the longer we have COVID running rampant overseas, the new variants that come out, the greater the risk that the vaccines we already have become ineffective over time. And there is a human cost to the fact that so many people are dying overseas, and I'm just not sure if we're doing enough to help them. So I do worry that, the borders opening is really dependent, not so much on us in some respects, it's what's happening overseas as well. And, there are pockets of absolute dire circumstances. How do you help that? Because we're in a really strong, our debt in relative terms is really good. Should we be doing more to help our nearest neighbours where it's a real problem? It's been great that the Pacific hasn't been as impacted and they've been able to keep it largely under control, but we have neighbours just to the north of us and who need help. We talked about the fact that we need to diversify the customers that we service, so potentially away from China. We do need to fix our relationship with China. That's absolutely critical. But India was always touted as another alternative market. How can we sit here and let that happen when economically we are, in some respects, looking at them as a future customer? So, it's fraught. I understand it's not popular, and, I have booked myself in for a vaccine, but it's a tricky situation, the vaccine rollout. We do need to fix our quarantine, so I just do not understand why we are not building quarantine capacity in this country to be able to deal with international students, migrants coming in, skilled migrants coming in, getting the Australians back. don't understand why we're not dealing with the quarantine capacity.
Gayle, do you agree with that? I mean, obviously there are a lot of businesses that are coming under your gaze at the moment that are a direct result of COVID and borders.
Well, I mean, the number one issue that we're seeing, particularly in that kind of SME and industries that are looking to reopen, like tourism and hospitality, is access to people and to staff and skilled and unskilled labour. So, it is a big challenge. Is there enough in the budget? I know there's spending on apprentices and letting students do more hours in certain areas, but it is a worry as to these businesses want to start opening. We need to give them the people to be able to operate and recover and grow. So it's going to be an ongoing challenge, I think, over the coming year.
Yeah.
I completely agree, Ming, though. You have to understand that our hotels are built for tourists. They're not quarantine centres. We don't have hotels that have got negative pressure rooms in them. Why there's been this delay of building quarantine centres is just astounding.
Yeah. Warwick, politically, I mean, we've all been captured by, or a number of states people have been captured by their premiers. They've got Stockholm syndrome. I mean, we all want to be locked up, don't we? And shut down.
Yeah.
So politically, this is quite problematic. I mean, even if we do get better results in other countries like India, even if we do get those inoculated who want to have a vaccine, is it actually going to lead to the opening up of domestic and international borders to give business enough certainty?
Well, a more rapid rollout of vaccine, I think everyone in this room would view that as a positive step, and it would bring decision-making closer to more open domestically and internationally. There are a few things you can do too. You could. I saw an interesting suggestion from Hong Kong the other day that where people have had their two vaccines and are clear, why not allow them to come immediately in? I'm in nursing homes, for example, 7,500 staff. The Nepalese are very, very evident in that community. How do we bring people in to fill that skill shortage when our migration, and that has a profound impact on population and productivity? So that we really need to be doing a lot more, and the physical quarantine systems have been, some have been successful, and some comment about the premiers in it. We haven't talked about, but the National Cabinet, it started to look to be quite an innovative and successful thing, but I wonder whether or not you've empowered states to be more I'd be quite happy to see Western Australia go on its own, so long as we could have all the income tax and the royalties from iron ore.
So long as.
Yeah. And Tasmania, well, we all got out of prison there, so I mean, they locked us back up again. So you just got to wonder where it's going. We're a nation first, and we need to make national decisions, and we need to make them quickly, and we need to make them effectively. And our colleague from Plantagenet Wines, good question, essential question, but the main answer to that is speed is of the essence, but do it cautiously and progressively and with real care to what's happening globally. But speed is of the essence for an economy that has to grow to be able to sustain itself, and that's us. And it has to happen now. And whether you want to tell your wines to domestically or internationally, we don't really care, but we want you to sell them, brother. We want you to sell them.
What you want to drink?
I think,
and Ming and I want to drink them.
No, I'm not a non-drinker, so you can have all the bottles.
I think this question about when our borders are going to open and this concept of having these vaccine passports is still a really tricky one.
Yeah.
Because as I understand it, for example, each of the vaccines are working in different ways. So, for example, I think this is right, that the Seychelles is the most vaccinated country in the world, whereas at the moment it's got the highest per capita rate of new cases of COVID-19. And it's because the vaccine that they've been using doesn't stop transmission. So if we start
it stops load, though. It reduces load,
It does.
Which is a very important.
But if you're trying to stop transmission,
Yeah. But I mean, was that...
You don't die from it is what I...
No, you don't die from it.
You
So
don't
that's
die
great
from it,
a
which is good, but you still
domestic population.
transmit.
You
Yeah.
still
Which I
transmit.
think if we remember back in the day when we were trying to find a vaccine, when no one thought we could do one, that was the aim, to stop us from dying and
Yep.
stop health systems
Absolutely.
from falling over.
Correct.
There's been a bit of mission creep maybe, do you think?
Yeah.
Anyone else got a last question? That's it. Yes, Louise. I should welcome you to our first...
Thank you. I'm going to play a newbie card and ask a question which I know both Warwick and Ming Long have mentioned, is how do we solve that relationship with our major customer?
You go first, Warwick.
Well, look,
Very good question.
this is the Consul General from
We're gonna
Great Britain. We are in prospect of seeing you become a much larger customer. And you used to be a great customer till you deserted us for those other Europeans. But in the meantime, we did find another customer. The world changes.
Can we say...
Yeah, but I was just going to say, we have. I'm just looking for some advice because we have similar problems with one of our large customers.
We do.
So,
Anyway, look, I think Italy's looking very progressive as moving up the scale. You've got to talk to people, you've got to be clear with people, and it's got to be about trade, it's got to be about price, it's got to be about quality, all the things that we need to focus on. But where are the large markets that we need to be in? We know where they are. Tastes have changed, focus has changed, and we both have the same dilemmas which we face in both countries. But we should be doing more together, and we're attempting to do that. And welcome again to Sydney.
No, it's a terrific question. And perhaps, Ming, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. Well, I understand the psyche of the Chinese and the 100 years of humiliation, and that word is really important. That is absolutely in their brain. And to have a tiny little country like Australia with 25 million people, you are not doing great things in all these areas. It does not go down well at all. And my sense is that there is a need for Australia, and there's almost like a need from China for Australia to the kowtow. I don't know if people understand the kowtow word. It's like an apology. I'm not sure if Australia has that level of humility to be able to apologise. So I feel like we're in the Mexican standoff. But my feeling is that as a country, our resolve around the issues we've raised will be tested to the extent that we are able to absorb the economic pain. And where is that level where the electorate will go, actually, it's now too much because we can't sell our wine to China, we can't sell to our biggest trading partner, and we will get tested. Now, whether it's, I've asked a number of people to have deeper connection to China than myself. What is going to solve this relationship? Mostly these people talk about the fact that you actually need a change in government because the current government is so entrenched in its position. There are certain people within government that are absolutely fighting the relationship, that it's almost irretrievable from that perspective. And so you naturally need a whole change in government to be able to reset. Now, does that reset? I actually don't know.
Is there a lesson, though? And everything that's been said I think is very important. Is there a lesson from this about eggs in one basket in terms of our trade? And no one's mentioned the H word. No one's mentioned hydrogen yet. And obviously it's not going to happen tomorrow. But looking at the investment going in and looking at, for example, Japan as a massive potential trading partner, they cannot. They haven't got a lot of renewable energy. Obviously, nuclear is an issue, so that they are sitting there as a customer.
Well, it's actually I would look at it as the whole world is actually sitting there as a potential customer around energy, which is the whole energy superpower. Australia can do this, right? We're not moving down that track, which is why I'm astounded. And then you look at, like we just talked about vaccinations in India being a potential other, sort of major trading partner, because you look at the population that's there and then we can service them. The UK is actually very important because just come out of Brexit, you need more friends in your corner. ASEAN becomes important to us as a other trading nations that we should be focusing on. Yeah. But in the end, you cannot avoid China. They are so big.
Yeah. I think you also need to put this in context as well. So the sales of iron ore to China are more than total exports Australia has with Japan as its next largest trading partner by some way. Yeah. The increase in export revenue that we got through iron ore sales alone last year was more than double the loss of revenue we had in the sales of the goods and services that China now doesn't want to buy from us.
But is that relationship, if it deteriorates, given the symbiotic nature that we have with iron ore, what is the downside risk?
Australia's the largest producer of iron ore by a long, long way. The reason why iron ore prices are so high at the moment is because of supply at the margin. In a sense, Vale in Brazil haven't been able to produce about 30 to 40 million tonnes of iron ore that were contracted with China, which means that the spot price for iron ore is skyrocketing. But the problem with China isn't a new one. It goes back well into at least that I know, well into the mid-2000s, starting with how we dealt with China around the free trade agreement and how we basically did a bait and switch with them with regards to their country designation.
Going back to iron ore, even if Vale comes back on board, Australian iron ore, there's a Simandou, there's some Africa, but this is a long way off. China needs Australian iron ore as well. So in terms of a catastrophic risk, that's not there, is it?
No, it's not. No, it's not. But it's about what's going to happen is demand for iron ore is going to moderate over the next decade as the building program in China starts to dissipate. Because they've already built their middle cities and all of those sorts of things.
And are there any other sectors that the panel thinks could be at risk if relationship got worse, not better?
Oh, everything.
Everything.
Yeah, all of it.
Everything.
Yeah, except for iron ore. Anything, the relationship with Australia will still remain strong in those sectors where we have a competitive advantage, we produce high quality output, and we do it at a reasonable price. So there's no reason to drop Australia in those markets. There is reason when you've got an increasingly poor relationship where you can find substitute supply.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me ask a last question, perhaps anybody who'd like to take it, but I'll kick off with Warwick. Going back to politics, how does this budget sit politically, do you think?
Politically, it's a good budget, politically, really. The country's recovered far more quickly than even the government thought. The government's taken advantage of the visitation of large revenues and applied them appropriately at a difficult time for the country. And the key groups, the key interest areas, including business, small and large, appreciative of the strategy of this budget. So politically, it moves them away from where they've always been to where some of us feel as though where they should have always been, but that's another discussion.
But you think a March election? You think a March election?
I think a March election, but Prime Ministers don't always listen to me, but that's very wise. But yeah, I think that.
So this is the last budget then before the election?
I think if Josh has done 3, he's done well. So, test his mandate. Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, Gayle, Warwick, Ming, Brendan, it's been great to put you through your paces.
Can I just make one point, not political, just to pick up on Brendan? Just on China, the biggest single export of China, its export of China, is its capital. Of the 5 largest banks in the world, the 4 largest are Chinese banks, by whatever measure you want to do it. the money that they have in sovereign bonds in a whole range of countries around the world, nearly $1 trillion in the United States. That is a leverage point that the French are thinking about, that the Italians are thinking about, that the Bulgarians are thinking about. There is other agendas that are at play here. Money doesn't run uphill for long. Money always looks for a return. And sovereign debt from China, because of its huge saving capability, has given it leverage in the markets all around the world. With its own growth and its own demand and its own domestic internal growth, these are issues that we need to be thinking about in how we put our strategy of, focused on values and realism. There's a big strategic shift taking place in the monies of the world, and China is part of that, and a very large part of it. We need to be sober about our thinking about this and how we deal with it and how we lock ourselves into long-term growth. It's something we don't talk about enough. The budget does a good job. It's good politically, but the big issues are still there.
Yeah. Warwick, great to get your views and that of the panel. I'd like to call on David Heathcote, National Managing Partner, Deals, Tax and Legal at KPMG, to give a vote of thanks. But panel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you all for those who have joined online. This is our first hybrid event, which I think has been a great success, and also the turnout we've had today in the room at the Fullerton Hotel. For me personally, it's been great insight, so I hope you've all enjoyed that. And thanks for everyone getting up very early this morning to attend to hear the insights. I'm a banker as well, Warwick, and I did love your first question, Tiki, and that was about rating out of 10. And if I combine the two scores we heard, that's a 7 out of 10. I would say that's probably a credit or a strong pass, which I think is pretty good. And I was talking to a number of you earlier today, and I thought if you reflected on 12 months ago about where we are today, I think you'd take where we are today at the drop of a hat, because we are in a pretty fortunate position. And Doug, I'm glad I didn't grow up in 1919, so very fortunate to be here today. And David McCready, also very fortunate that I'm not leading a global tax business in London at the moment, and very pleased to be seeing some really healthy growth prospects in Australia and leading the deals, tax and legal business. Personally, I wanted to make a special thank to our special guests. Min Long, thank you, and Warwick Smith always makes it very entertaining, and hopefully you've enjoyed those insights. And also to our subject matter experts at KPMG, Dr. Brendan Rynne and Gayle Dickerson, thank you so much. And last but not least, I wanted to pass a special thanks to Tiki, who very skillfully navigated and made it entertaining today and lively. So thank you all. And of course, it wouldn't be possible without all you in the room, all our clients who have been very supportive of KPMG for a number of years. Thank you so much. And also for those online. So I'm going to wrap it up there. And please, special thanks also on behalf of the British Chamber of Commerce, Australian British Chamber of Commerce, and also those who you haven't seen today. And I encourage you to all go onto our website, because there is enormous insights and materials for all of you to leverage in terms of what the budget means for your business. And these teams have been up all night. It's probably easier just to go on your apps on the way back to work, because it's very easy to navigate. And even for CFOs, it has insights in terms of what this means for you. So there's something in it for everyone. It's very colourful, and I very much encourage you to leverage those insights. So thanks again, and looking forward to seeing you again at the next budget. Thank you.
Yeah.
For those of you in the room, and I'm not sure this will work necessarily if the camera gets that, but inside there's a QR code. We're now all familiar with these things, which will take you straight to the KPMG materials that Dave's just spoken about. So please avail yourself of that. Now we all know how to use those QR codes so well. Thank you very much, David, for your closing comments. I'd like to add my thanks as well to the panel. It's always terrific to have a really good, robust conversation and a number of different points of view represented. And so thank you very much for that. And Tiki, as always, it's lovely to be able to call on a board member who's able to wrangle a panel like this. So thank you very much, Tiki, for doing that for us today. Just finally, in closing, I'd just like to draw your attention, as well as I've done the KPMG part that I needed to remember to do. The second thing is we've got a list of upcoming events that we'd like to draw to your attention. Most importantly, from my point of view, and I think will be very interesting and relevant to many of you in the room, is we have the Honourable Dan Tehan speaking for us next Friday. That's not this week, but next week, the 21st of May, over at Crown Casino. We're going to try out their new premises. We've got the Pearl Room over there, so please come and join us for that. Dan's obviously fresh from his visit to the UK to meet with Liz Truss, and the negotiating teams are currently in a 5-week sprint to try and get an agreement in principle that could be signed between the two Prime Ministers at the G7 meeting at the beginning of June. So it's an important time to hear from the Minister, so we encourage you to come along to that. There are other events there as well to avail yourselves of. Could I just, on the FTA piece, just ask you if there is anything that you think you might like to see, we need to know about that now. So if you have a thought or something that you'd like to contribute or something that your business would like to see in the FTA, please advise us of that now. You can do that very easily. It's policy@britishchamber.com or just ring us up, let us know. We're talking all the time with the negotiating teams, but if you don't do it now, as they say in the beginning of weddings, speak now or forever hold your peace. This is the opportunity. So please do avail yourselves of that opportunity and let us know what you'd like to see. On that note, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you again to the panel, and thank you very much, all of you in the room, for coming. And for those online, thank you for joining us as well. Thank you very much.